Hello everyone, Mr. B here, and I know it's hard to believe, but we are actually almost done with Unit 3, because we're in the last part, which is Chapter 9. And so if we look at it, as I've been doing, if you look at your review guide, we are going to be starting with modules 9.1 and 9.2 today, and there are 4 things from your next exam that are going to be covered. So maturation, fetal stage, rubella during pregnancy, and the Babinski reflex. So let's get right into it. And when we talk about Chapter 9, what we're talking about is human development. And human development, let me make myself disappear. Human development is essentially looking at, there we go. There we go. The branch of psychology that studies the systematic changes that occur during the lifespan. So it's looking at our development. It's looking at just how we change physically, mentally, different theories as to why we seem to change, how we can develop more effectively, if there's specific time frames that we go through. And so that's what we mean when we talk about developmental psychology. And I am just going to be skimming the surface, because developmental psychology is probably one of the biggest fields of psychology out there. It is so big, in fact, that child development psychology is also its own kind of subcategory. And I know I kind of went a little ahead, but what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk about prenatal development, and then we're also going to talk about, for 9.2, infant development. So the way that this chapter is set up is it's just going to go through the regular development of a human and the different theories that we have. So when we talk about prenatal development and we talk about developmental psychology, we're looking at, a lot of the times, maturation. And this is the first thing that you will need to know for the exam. And when we talk about maturation, it's this whole idea of the biological unfolding of an organism according to its underlying generic blueprint. So what this means is when we are changing physically, psychologically, all of that, all based upon our generic blueprint. So, whether you interact with someone or not, the way that they are changing and developing is their maturation. They are maturing. That's where that word comes from. So a lot of times when people think about it, and think about this idea of puberty, which happens in adolescence, which we are going to talk about, that is one of the areas of maturation. But we're going to start with prenatal first. And these are kind of all the different stages that we're going to talk through, some quicker than others. Again, we're going to go into prenatal and kind of infancy, maybe a little bit of toddler in this video. Then we're going to do kind of childhood in the next, adolescence in the one after that, and then adulthood in the last. When we talk about prenatal development, this is development that happens before a child is born. So this is kind of those, roughly speaking, the first 9 months from conception to birth. And the prenatal development can be broken down further into 3 stages. So you see the very first stage is the union of the sperm and egg, which makes a zygote, which is just a fertilized egg cell. And there's this germinal stage that goes from the time of fertilization, so conception, to about 1 to 2 weeks afterwards. So that is when we would consider it a zygote. It then goes on into what we'd call the embryonic stage, so when it's an embryo. And this goes from about, the 1 to 2 week part to the 8th week. And the picture that you see here is an embryo 6 to 7 weeks old. What we're going to be focusing on for the most part when we talk about prenatal development, and what you will need to know for the exam, is then this last stage of prenatal development, which is the fetal stage. And this is when you have something that is then known as a fetus. And this happens, and this is what you will need to know, it's from week 9 all the way up to delivery, which is usually, the 9 months, but sometimes it can happen sooner if someone is born prematurely. But from 9 weeks through to delivery is what we call the fetal stage. This is an example. The picture that you see here is of a fetus that is about 16 weeks old. And this just kind of is what it looks like. Again, you've probably learned about this in your health class. But when a fetus, this would be an example of a fetus, is developing inside the mother. And there's different things. You have, of course, the amniotic sac, which is where the baby is. There's amniotic fluid inside that sac, which essentially is there to protect the child, to protect the fetus, the embryo, as it were. So if there was ever any force, being filled, around with fluid makes it less likely for the fetus to be hurt. You then have the placenta, and this is what has all the different nutrients and everything that the fetus needs. And then you have the umbilical cord that connects the placenta to the fetus. So it can get all the nutrients it needs. It also gets rid of any waste that isn't needed. So that's just, quick little health lesson. And then this is very important. So there are threats to prenatal development. A lot of times when we talk about developmental psychology, people focus on development after a child is born, but there's a lot of stuff that can affect the embryo, the fetus, what have you, later on the child, before the child's even born. And the various things, which are usually environmental, that influence or can harm the developing embryo or fetus is what we call a teratogen. A little background history of what teratogen means. If you break down that word, teratogen, it actually means monster maker, which is a little rude, but it was a term that was created a very, very long time ago. Because a lot of times fetuses, embryos, all of that, that were affected by these things when they were born looked a little different. And so that is where the phrase monster maker and teratogen comes from. And there's many different things, many different teratogens out there, but for the sake of this class, we're going to very quickly talk about 3. The first one is one that you will, again, need to know for the exam. And there are various infectious diseases. So there's rubella, which if you recall is the one that you will need to know, HIV or AIDS, or syphilis. So this means that the mother has this infectious disease at the time of pregnancy. And these various infectious diseases have been linked to birth defects such as heart disease, deafness, and intellectual disabilities. So for the sake of the exam, you will need to know those 3 things. That if someone has rubella during pregnancy, it gives an increased risk for heart disease, deafness, and intellectual disability. Some other teratogens out there include smoking. So if a mother is smoking while pregnant, it has been linked to something that is known as sudden infant death syndrome, which I'm sure you can imagine what that is. And then lung problems or asthma in the child later on through development. And then the last one is if the parent is under the influence of alcohol or drugs during the time of pregnancy, it can result in something known as fetal alcohol syndrome, which I will be showing you a picture of very shortly. Because it can cause facial deformities, also a lower IQ score later on in development, and some cognitive delays when compared to other children. And so this is a picture of a child with the kind of stereotypical characteristics of fetal alcohol syndrome. So a smaller head, small eye openings, a sunken nasal bridge, a shorter nose, flat cheekbones, and then a smooth, thin upper lip. These are just some of the characteristics that tend to be seen. It is not guaranteed that they are the characteristics that you would see, but just ones that we have found for fetal alcohol syndrome. And then this is just another thing for your knowledge of critical periods in prenatal development. So it shows, again, the risk of major structural abnormalities during certain times of development is in the blue, so like this. And then the green is more when there's minor structure abnormalities. So this just shows that when you're going through the germinal, embryonic, and fetal stage, kind of what things are developing when, and therefore what damage can be done more severely when. So of course you'll see things like the central nervous system and the heart are kind of the first few things to develop. And so because of that, any, damage that's being done early on can affect the central nervous system and the heart more majorly than later on, when usually they're already, for the most part, developed. So it's just minor ones. And that was it for prenatal development. Because it's short, we're going right into infant development. So this is after the child has been born. So again, prenatal is before birth. Now we're an infant. And you will see that right after a child is born, when they're an infant, they have certain reflexes. And so these do not need to be taught. They just do automatically. So you have the palmar grasp reflex, which just means that they got a really good grasp in their arms. If you put anything around their hand, they will immediately grasp it as a reflex. They're not thinking about it, they just do it. You also have the rooting reflex, which is similar also to the sucking reflex, which if you put a finger, if you do anything around an infant's face or cheek, they will immediately kind of move their head to it and start sucking on it. And this has to do for kind of a survival instinct of finding the nipple to get milk. And then we also have the Murrow reflex. And this is the reflex that if you put a baby on its back, or if you are holding a baby and you kind of lean it backwards, the baby will immediately put its hands and legs out to kind of, prevent itself from falling. That is a reflex. And the idea for why we have that reflex is way back when, from our ancestors, that used to be in trees, and the whole idea was it helped to keep the infant alive in case they were, about to fall out of a tree or, fall out of their parents' grasp. The other reflex that is not on here, but is going to be on the exam, is Babinski. And the Babinski reflex is when infants are curling and fanning their toes. So you'll see that if you have an infant and you just rub their feet, you'll see that they start kind of expanding their feet out and like curling their toes in. So that is the curling and fanning of toes, and we call it Babinski. So you will need to know that for the exam. Other things just about infants, when it comes to sensory, they do not have good eyesight. So they do not rely on vision to recognize their parents, and specifically their primary caregiver. Instead, they rely more on smell, they rely more on auditory, so hearing, and recognizing a voice, but not so much vision. So just random facts. And you'll see in this picture kind of how a newborn would see their mom. It's very, very blurry. Another thing is the idea of depth perception, and the research that we've done seems to show that a child does not start to have their depth perception until around 6 months. And we know this from this imaginary cliff or visual cliff study that was done by Gibson and Walk, where, as you can see, there's this glass pane. And so it looks like if you went off this ledge, you would fall, because, you see right through. And so what they would do is they would put a child on one end, and then the mom or primary caregiver would call them, and they would look to see when a child stopped, just from their point of view, walking across, the cliff. And it was found that around 6 months is when they would start to hesitate, and, they start to cry. They didn't want to go beyond that gap because from what they saw, they were about to fall. It could be argued that also, again, their vision is not the best, so there's still research being done, but it seems like, to the best of our knowledge, depth perception goes around 6 months. And then, again, for your knowledge, this just shows various skills and abilities, both sensory, learning, and motor, that happens approximately at different times of development in infants. And so you'll see that it goes through. It should be mentioned that if you ever have a child of your own, and, just looking at this, let's say that they, where's a good one? I'll go to the last one. for being able to walk or hold up without support. If they're at 12 months and they still don't quite have it, that's fine. These are just approximate ages. Some children, they'll develop them a little sooner. Other children a little later, and that's fine. The only time it would be reason of concern is if it seems to be very, very delayed. And even then, you just go to a doctor, get it checked out. A lot of parents, they like to brag if their child, rolls over sooner than predicted and all that. And then, other parents might feel like, oh, their child is lacking. No. Every child is different. They develop at their own speed. The only time that it's of concern again is if it's way, way out of those approximate milestones. And that is actually it. So because this is a shorter video, I'm actually quickly going back. And so if we go to the review, again, the things that you need to know for this video is maturation, which is the unfolding of an organism due to its underlying genetic code. And again, you'll see that definition right there in the PowerPoints. The thing to know about the fetal stage is that it is the stage of prenatal development from week 9 through to delivery. When we talk about rubella during pregnancy, the thing to know about this is that it increases the child for a risk of heart disease, deafness, and intellectual disability. And then the very last thing, when we're talking about infants, is this idea of Babinski, which is the reflex where an infant's toes curl and fan out. So it's kind of opening and closing. And so that is it for Module 9.1 and 9.2. When we come back, we're going to just be covering 9.3 and talking about childhood development, because there is a lot to unfold in that. So I will see you guys then.